There's a website called crazyguyonabike.com. I may have mentioned it once before on the show. But if you go to this website and in the top right corner, you search for the word Bangladesh, the number one search result is a journal called Song of the Little Road by Graham Finch. It's an excellent story about Graham's cycling adventure through Bangladesh. And also, it's a great place to see some amazing photos that Graham took of Bangladesh and the people of Bangladesh as he rode his bike through the country. And I mention this because after listening to today's episode, you might want to go there and take a look at some of these photos. This is episode 169 with Ian Packham. You might remember that name because Ian's been on the show before, back in episode 50, where he talked about his adventure around Africa. This time, Ian has walked across Bangladesh. But before we get into today's episode, if you want to get in touch, you can send me an email at paul@thepursuitzone.com, or you can leave me a voice message at speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone if you want to get your voice on the show. And now, let me introduce Ian. Located between India and Myanmar, Bangladesh is a country about the size of England and Wales, but with 3 times the population. From January through March 2019, Ian Packham was on a self-supported trek across Bangladesh. It was 665.8 miles on foot, starting in St. Martin's Island in the south and ending in the country's northernmost point. His plan is to uncover the stories of one of the world's hidden destinations. You can learn more about Ian and his adventures at his website, encircleafrica.org. Ian Packham, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
So Ian, this is the second time we're now talking, and the first time was about your Africa trip. This time is about walking through Bangladesh. What is it about this type of travel that you enjoy so much?
That's such a tough question. But I think whatever I do, I just like to challenge myself in one way or another. So, for example, this walk through Bangladesh was by far the longest trek or walking experience I'd done, countering other trips like my circumnavigation of Africa, which was much more challenging in other ways.
What were the differences and the challenges? Because I remember in Africa, weren't you doing a lot of travel by public transportation?
Yeah, that's right. So that was entirely by public transportation as it exists in Africa. So the challenges were less physical. Obviously, I was doing walking, but not on a day-to-day constant basis, but more to do with communication and the sort of struggles of using those forms of public transport.
So more logistical.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, Bangladesh, it's a country I think that people know about, but what are the important things that we should know about Bangladesh?
That's another good question. You kind of mentioned it in your introduction. It's one of the most densely populated countries anywhere in the world. It's still a very rural country with 9 out of 10 people still living and working in the countryside. In addition to that, it's basically one huge floodplain from the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers, and 98% of it is low-lying. So it is one of the countries which is going to experience vulnerabilities from climate change much more than anywhere else. And in addition to that, the last thing I would say is that foreign visitors of any sort are really very rare in Bangladesh.
Why did you choose Bangladesh as your destination?
I'd sort of been looking for a reason to head to Bangladesh for a while now. I've got various friends who hail from Bangladesh, and I've met people all around the world who keep telling me what a great country it was. So I was looking for that reason. And then when I sort of did some very quick investigations into it, found it was a reasonably sized country. It connected up well with my other wish to go on a longer walking trek.
Now, you originally were thinking this was going to be around 1,000 miles, but it ended up being around 665. How did that discrepancy come about?
Basically, how I went about it was I pulled out a map of the country and drew a straight line from the southernmost point to the northernmost point, which comes out at about 450 miles. And then I was trying to work out from that, given the roads aren't going to perfectly follow that straight line, what distance I might be having to travel. And I came to the conclusion that 1,000-mile marker would be sort of the longest I would absolutely have to travel on this trip.
From the beginning, did you always think this would be a walking adventure, or did you consider other modes of transport?
As I say, I'd been looking to head to Bangladesh for a while, but when I connected the two up of going to Bangladesh and wanting to go on a walking trek, it was always going to be walking, which is just as well, because I discovered public transport in Bangladesh is not really built for somebody who's 5'11" in height.
So what kind of planning did you have to do?
This was probably the least planned of any of my adventures. So what I basically did was I found a guidebook, and I read as much as I could from other sources about Bangladesh, the history, the geography, although it has to be said there aren't a great many books out there on Bangladesh. And then more practically, I just tried to do as much walking as I could, carrying a backpack load with me to try and prepare my body as much as possible for the walk.
What was your training regimen?
So it wasn't very regimented or very military. It was basically once a week I would try and head out for the day, so walking 10, 12 miles with the backpack, going uphill, going downhill, just trying to mix it up a little bit, but get those miles into my body.
And how many weeks prior to going were you doing that?
So I probably started that once a week walk 2 months before my departure day.
Did it prove to be adequate?
I think so. I mean, obviously I managed to succeed in doing the trip overall. And the first few days of the walking, I felt pretty good and pretty strong. So I think it did prepare me enough without tiring my muscles out.
What, in terms of like visas and vaccinations and things like that you have to do?
So a visa, yeah, you need a visa, which is fairly easy to come by. And vaccinations, actually, you just need the normal vaccinations they recommend for living in the UK. You don't need anything special. It's quite a safe destination in that respect.
So just a normal tourist visa covered you for your time frame?
Yes, so you can, if you're going for a shorter time frame, you can actually get a visa at arrival at the international airport in Dhaka. But if you're going for the sort of 3 months I was aiming for, I had to just apply at the High Commission for a standard 3-month tourist visa.
When you set that line from the southernmost point to the northernmost, was that your route planning, or did you have other route planning in between, and how did that vary as you went along?
So when I first looked at a map of Bangladesh, I sort of marked out all the points that would be potentially interesting to visit for whatever reason. And I very quickly realized that the vast majority of them lined up pretty much with that southernmost and northernmost straight line I drew, which runs diagonally across the country in a sort of northeasterly direction. So that rapidly became an obvious route to take across the country.
What were some of those sites that lined up that you wanted to visit?
So if I just sort of start from the south, you've got my starting point, which is St. Martin's Island, which is unique in Bangladesh because it's the country's only coral island. And then you head up, you've got Cox's Bazar, which is known for having the longest beach in the world. Then you go up to Chittagong, which is known for its boat building historically, into Dhaka, the capital, and then up, keep going north. You start hitting ancient Hindu ruins from when it was kind of part of India historically, and then keep going up into the northernmost point obviously in the very far north of the country.
Ian, what are you carrying with you? What's in your kit?
So I had basic camping equipment with me. So I had an inflatable mattress, sleeping bag liner, things like that. I had a second set of clothing, so I only took 2 sets of clothing with me because I was trying to keep my bag really as light as possible. I don't have this huge build, so it was important to reduce the weight down as much as was possible.
So St. Martin's, how did you go about getting to that starting point?
Actually, it was quite easy to get there. It's something of a sort of a holiday destination for Bangladeshis. So there are regular buses that go from Dhaka down to Teknaf, which is nearest port, and then a ferry goes during the summer months, which is sort of the UK winter, down to the islands on a daily basis.
And what was St. Martin's like?
Well, it's pretty much your standard, beautiful, tranquil, tropical island. Beaches stretching all along around the coast. A very traditional culture in some respects. Most people, before the onset of tourism, were making their living out of fishing. So it was a very pleasant way to start this journey.
And when you're walking, are you walking on roads? And are the roads paved, or are they dirt? Or tell me about that.
So it was a big mix, actually. I was trying to avoid the main highways as much as possible, but I did have to walk along the edge of those on occasion. Otherwise, it was sort of, secondary or tertiary roads, which had various qualities of surface to them, running right down into little tracks running through farmland and through paddy fields, which I was following.
What were the dangers that you were possibly facing out there?
I don't think there were any major dangers. It's a fairly safe destination. Obviously, in any sort of undeveloped or developing country, road transportation tends to be the biggest danger and tends to be something people don't really think about. But beyond that, my worries were really about language and sort of access to the route I was planning to take. I didn't know whether I'd be passing through private land and whether people would allow me to do that, or whether it would be as easy as it turned out to be of just walking along these tracks and no one bothering me.
Were you worried about wildlife at all?
Not to a great deal. There are elephants in the far south of Bangladesh, and also tigers in the wetland area, but generally Bangladesh is more about sort of human wildlife rather than anything that's going to cause any danger.
So once you make it across St. Martin's Island, I'm guessing you get back on the ferry back over to the mainland, and then do you begin walking from there?
That's right. As soon as I walked the length of St. Martin's Island, which is about 5 miles or so a nice easy first day, and then caught the ferry back to mainland Bangladesh, walked off the ferry, and just started my walk, yeah.
And like when you get to the end of your day, are you just camping out every night, or are you meeting locals and able to stay with them? What was your experience?
So it was a combination of things. I was, whenever possible, trying to make sort of days that would end me in a village or a town where I might be able to find accommodation. So that's what I did most of the time. But there were times when, I've walked for 20 miles and there's still nothing around, and then I would be wild camping for the night.
So you got into a small town or a village, and were you able to find, is it hotels typically, or just locals that would host you in their house?
So I don't think you could class it as a hotel as such, but guest house or a traveller's night spot somewhere, with just a bed and perhaps just a bucket of water to wash yourself down for the night.
And what's the cost for that?
That could range, I think the cheapest I stayed in was an English pound, and then if you stayed in a proper hotel, you'd be looking at maybe 20 to 30 pounds a night.
What's the currency they use there?
They use the Bangladeshi taka.
So you're heading northwest, I guess, and you'll have to remind me again. The St. Martin's, that was the coral reef, and then what was the next destination you mentioned? The next kind of big site that you...
So from St. Martin's Islands, I took the ferry to Teknaf, and that was where I started my mainland walking.
And then from there, you mentioned something about a place that was big on boat building, and I can't remember the other one.
Yeah, so from Teknaf, the next big sort of destination was Cox's Bazar, which has the longest, or one of the longest, beaches in the world. It's all a little bit dubious as to who actually has that longest beach. And then from there, I continued north to Chittagong, which is known for its boat building.
So Cox's Bazar, what was that like?
It's actually turning into quite a tourist destination like St. Martin's Island. And when I say that, really, I mean for domestic tourism with Bangladeshis heading to the beach just to enjoy some time by the seafront. So a very relaxed atmosphere to it. And though it's one of Bangladesh's largest cities, it's really not very big at all.
And then you're Chittagong and the boat building. What's that place like?
That is where you sort of hit this hectic nature that perhaps people associate with Bangladesh, or when they see images of it on television, they'll see, rickshaws and trucks and people racing around. But all the same, it's still a very welcoming city in many, many ways, particularly for me. Everyone was always interested in why I was in a particular destination and what I was doing there.
And what was their reaction to your answer?
I tended not to tell people I was planning to walk the entire length of Bangladesh. I discovered very quickly they were very protective of foreigners, telling me that a hotel I'd planned to stay in wasn't safe or something like that. So I feared that if I told them I was going to walk the whole country, that they would just tell me it wasn't possible or it was too dangerous and try and stop me. So I would just say I was traveling around the country to experience what there was to experience. And they were very receptive and very happy that I was doing that.
Did they give you any recommendations of where to go?
Oh, all the time. And they were almost always away from my planned route.
So were you carrying any communication equipment with you, a mobile phone perhaps?
Yes, I had my everyday smartphone that I have in the UK. I was using that together with my laptop to communicate with the outside world and keep working and all of everything else that goes on with sort of travel in the 21st century.
Did you use that phone as a navigation aid, or how were you able to navigate?
I managed to find a Bangladeshi hiking group who had some high-resolution US Army maps of Bangladesh from the Cold War. So that I used as my sort of larger scale mapping system. And then for the day-to-day finding the right path in a city or town, I was just using a basic mapping app on my smartphone, yes.
What about river crossings? Is your route happen to just line up with bridges, or are you having to figure out how to get across rivers? How did that work?
So for the most part, I managed to sort of collide with major bridges, and in smaller rivers, you'd get to the bank and you'd often find there was a guy there who's sort of taken it upon himself to run people across the river for a small fee. And rivers and water crossings of all sorts are pretty much impossible to avoid in Bangladesh. I think there's something like 700 rivers in the country, so it's a massive part of life, and a very ordinary way of getting about is by traveling by boat.
What were you eating out there for lunch and for dinner?
Oh, I was very much enjoying all the local food there is there. So curries of various forms, pakora, which are little sort of deep fried balls of potato and onion, samosas. Big fan of the dal there, which is just sort of a lentil curry. And tea is a big cultural institution in Bangladesh, so it was always very easy after a couple of hours of walking, I'd always end up in a village. Even the smallest village would have a tea stall where I could get a little glass of tea and a snack to keep me on for the next 2 hours of walking.
When you're walking out there and you're looking across the landscape, what do you see? Is it very agricultural, or is it mountainous? Tell me about that.
So it's very flat. It's basically all the land is floodplain, as I think I said. So it's basically layers and layers of mud that have built up over thousands of years, which makes it very fertile. So yes, there's a huge amount of agriculture. It's mostly paddy fields growing rice, which is the staple food in Bangladesh. But I also saw fields of potatoes and carrots and sort of crops you would actually more associate with Europe than you would with the Indian subcontinent.
Are there a lot of trees?
There aren't huge forests, but there are a fair number of trees lining roads, providing shade. No huge forests, but there are regular trees around, yeah.
What was your budget for this?
That's a great question. Bangladesh is thankfully cheap, so I've worked out the entire walk. So that was around about 2 months in Bangladesh, excluding my flight and my visa, came in at £700. So that's around about $900.
Not bad for not having to wild camp and being able to eat, have someone else cook you food and all that.
Absolutely. I certainly wasn't skimping when I was out there. I was staying in whatever hotel I found, eating whenever I was hungry. And compared to living in the UK, I think that's pretty good.
Was malaria a concern at all?
No, thankfully. There's only one part of Bangladesh, the Chittagong Hill Tracts, which have malaria constantly. And that was a part of Bangladesh I wasn't going into. So I didn't have to worry about taking malaria medication. Though mosquitoes do exist in the rest of the country, they do carry dengue fever. So I was using a mosquito net whenever there was a threat. I was outside or the hotel was particularly buggy.
So after Chittagong, you continue your travels, and I think is the next big destination the capital, Dhaka?
Yes, pretty much. So from Chittagong, I was skirting the coast until a place called Feni, which isn't a major destination. So the next biggest place was Dhaka, which was actually my halfway point for the journey.
Describe Dhaka.
It's fairly polluted, it must be said, and pretty crazy in all manner. There are market stalls everywhere, all manner of forms of transport, and people very busy, very active, rushing around, living their lives, really like any other major capital, but it is huge. It took me an entire day to walk from the southern area of the capital to the northern area of the capital.
How about the noise? Is there a lot of horn honking?
Yes. If you look at the guidebook, they sort of recommend you find a place to sleep which is higher up in the building, because the further up you go, the less you suffer from the horn honking, which goes on all day, all night, and pretty much constantly, I think.
After you break out of the northern point of Dhaka and you get back into more rural areas, what's the next destination?
So the next big destination was probably a city called Bogra, which isn't hugely interesting from a tourist point of view, but it has all of those things that you want after you've been walking for a few days. A fairly decent hotel where you can scrub up, different combinations of food and the like, so you can just rest up and prepare yourself for the next push.
Did you ever take any 0 days?
At the beginning, there was just a couple and less than I was expecting to take. But as I hit area around Bogra, I actually hurt my foot quite badly. So I had to take 5-6 days off, basically not walking at all, not, doing as little as possible on that foot to try and help it recover so I could continue on the journey.
What happened? Did you twist your ankle or?
It wasn't anything as dramatic as that. It was just, I think, a combination of several hard days of walking 20 plus miles. It was just rubbing a little bit and just got sore to the point where it was too painful to walk on, basically.
Sure. I want to circle back around to Dhaka again, because I think if I heard you right, you didn't really spend a whole lot of time there. You basically just spent a day just to get through the city and get out of it. Is that correct?
So there was that day crossing the city, and then in addition to that, I had 1 or 2 days to explore what Dhaka had to offer.
What were kind of the highlights of Dhaka?
In many ways, it's a microcosm of the entire country. So you'll suddenly come across this stunning mosque dating back 400 years, or a palace from the Mughal period, and then you'll hit this brand new university building or something from the British Raj period. So it's really somewhere, it doesn't have any major sites, as it were, but it's somewhere you can just wander around, turning corners and just finding these spectacular pieces of architecture, all these little parkland areas where you can relax in for a few minutes before trying to find something else which interests you.
The town we last left off at, did you say Bogra?
Yeah, that's right.
From Bogra, you continue on. Where to next?
From Bogra, it sort of gets more and more rural, and the cities that do exist get smaller and smaller. So I guess the next big marker for me was I started to come very close to the Indian border on the west of Bangladesh, because there's a little bit of the state of West Bengal in India which sticks out quite far into Bangladesh, to the point that you can see the border fence, towers with soldiers on, making sure no one tries to sneak across. And then from there, really, it was just pushing on until the northernmost point.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, and I'm just curious about the border between India and Bangladesh. Is there some kind of tensions, or are they, how stringent are they at trying to keep people out at that point?
In many ways, they are very friendly neighbours. There is still a great respect for India because it helped Bangladesh gain its independence from what was then West Pakistan. But in other ways, there is a little bit of difficulty between the neighbours. India has spent a lot of money building this brand new border fence that pretty much surrounds Bangladesh, and that's because so many Bangladeshis were sneaking across the border into India where they can earn more money.
Yeah, because I was just thinking what you said at the beginning with the issues with climate change and flooding and all that more and more people are going to want to move somewhere else.
Yes, exactly. A lot of the large population centres are going to suffer from climate change. Even regularly during the monsoon season, you'll see photos of Dhaka and the other big cities sort of knee-deep in water, and that's before you've taken climate change into consideration. So I think you unfortunately are going to see these mass movements of people, and that's something, as I say, with this border fence that India seems to be preparing itself for.
When you were going between villages, just walking along the road, did people stop at those points and talk to you and invite you for tea and that sort of thing? Or was that a thing that only happened as you got into a village?
I think pretty much everyone I met on the road at any point stopped me for a conversation or tried to stop me. Obviously, when you have that many people wanting to talk to you, you can't always stop for a long conversation with them. You have this distance you need to go in a day, and you have a pace. Once you've got your pace going, you don't really want to break that unless you absolutely have to. But yes, the people, even in the smallest villages, were very interested in why I was there. Normally just out of curiosity, but sometimes I think there was a sort of security element to their questions as well.
Did you ever have any run-ins with law enforcement?
Only good ones, it has to be said, which is perhaps the best example of that is I was stopped at a Bangladeshi border guard at that point where India and Bangladesh the border came close to my route, and he was asking me sort of standard security questions, if you like. But it turned out he was just interested, and then he took me for lunch, and he bought me my lunch in a nearby tea stall, and then said, "Okay, good luck, see you later," sort of thing.
So you're passing this point where you can see the border fence. From that point, how much more of your journey remains?
There's still probably 100 miles or so to the end of my journey, because, as I say, this bit of India sticks into Bangladesh, and then there's another whole sort of northern provinces of Bangladesh to go through.
You mentioned there was a city where they have some old Hindu ruins, or maybe it's not a city, maybe it's just an area. What was that place like?
Yeah, these ruins, both Hindu temples or very old ancient mosques as well, they just tend to be sitting in the countryside. So you'd just be walking along through the rice fields, and then suddenly there'd be this beautiful 16th century pink mosque, for example. So they weren't really set up as tourist sites, and if you tried to look them up even on the internet, you probably wouldn't find of their existence. So that was one of the most charming parts of the trip, just walking along and discovering these sites that you would never experience any other way of traveling.
What happens during the last 100 miles?
Good question. A lot more walking, really. And it was at that point, it sort of felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. My average was 12 miles a day every day for the journey, but it felt like I'd sort of stalled in my progress. But that turned out to be largely because I was looking at the wrong place on the map, and I was much further on than I thought I was. And as I said, the towns and villages tended to get smaller and smaller, and feeling much more remote from the world that I experienced in Dhaka and in the south of Bangladesh.
What happens when you get to the end? What do you see?
Well, there was this really dirty industrial road leading towards the border with India, and I was thinking, this isn't a very good way to end the journey. And then suddenly I came across this big sort of statue of a zero, which is the Bangladeshi 0 point, and there was a few stalls selling souvenirs and trinkets, and a little school group who were visiting from Bangladesh. So it was actually turned out to be quite a nice end point for my trip compared to what I thought when I was walking along that really dirty industrial road.
I'm not familiar with that term, 0 point. What is that?
So it's just the term they use. They measure the distances in Bangladesh from this point.
Okay.
So that's 0 point, and then mile 1, mile 2,
okay,
all the way along.
I get it. Well, I mean, it sounds like you've got an amazing amount of things that you have discovered and stuffed into your brain. Are you going to... do you have a book planned about this?
Yeah, so the way I work is I always write a detailed diary when I'm traveling, and then sort of the next job for me now, a month after being back, is to start scrolling through that diary, putting it together, and seeing if it creates an interesting and rounded narrative. And at that point, I'll decide whether I want to approach publishers for a book. But that is certainly the plan. And I think, as you say, there are so many intriguing elements to Bangladesh that can be included as part of this journey. I think it would make a good story for people who don't know much about this area of the world.
Over the course of the trip, what do you think turned out to be the biggest challenge?
Do you know, I took it on a day-to-day basis. So really it was just doing that average of 12 miles a day pretty much every single day. Sometimes it would seem to go in a flash, and other times, I seem to be drawing on every sort of minuscule bit of strength I have left to complete this distance I needed to do to get to my day's endpoint.
Was that a good time of year temperature-wise? What temps were you seeing?
It was pretty good walking temperatures, actually. It was sort of, when I started out, it was probably the mid-20s Celsius, and then it started to get a little bit warmer as time went on, and the south gets more and more humid as those months go on towards the monsoon. So that's why one of the reasons I started in the south and headed north, rather than starting in the north and heading south.
So maybe 75 to 85 Fahrenheit. That's pretty good.
Yeah, something like so. It wasn't, ridiculously hot, and there was normally some shade from the trees on the side of the road to help as well.
Do you have a memorable moment that sticks out in your mind?
There were so many sort of tiny little moments of people going out of their way to find me a cup of tea, or just show me that I was welcome in their country in other small ways. Or, for example, there were many times when people would walk along the road with me for half an hour, just to talk and learn a little bit about me in a way I've never experienced anywhere else I've been traveling.
What's your biggest takeaway from the adventure?
Do you know, it's probably the same takeaway I have from every adventure I do, and then seem to forget when I'm back in my home country. And that's that fundamentally everyone in the world is a good person, and they are so kind and willing to help when you need that help. If you watch the news, you so often think of the world as this dangerous and threatening place, which is not what I get from any of my travels to date.
For somebody who wants to travel like you do, what advice would you have for them?
I think definitely read up on your destination and more widely. It doesn't have to be technical works, but just reading what other people have experienced in the country is a good thing, so you know whether you're going to enjoy yourself, basically. But at the same time, you don't want to read so much and have a journey which is so planned that there is no sort of surprise in that. The other thing I would say, coming from a scientific background, is absolutely do everything you can to protect your health while you're away. So take whatever vaccinations you're told to take all the medicines you might need, and filter all of your water, and then you shouldn't have any major health scares while you're away.
When you reached the end, did you hop on a bus back to Dhaka?
Pretty much, yes. So saw the 0 point, spent a little bit of time there, and then hopped on a bus to the nearest town, which is this very small town called Tentulia. And then from there, just a series of buses back down to Dhaka.
How easy is it to figure out the bus system?
If you sort of looked on paper, it would be impossible to figure out, I think. But my standard technique of wandering around and asking everyone I can works really well in Bangladesh. And even, they might not speak very much English. I certainly don't speak any Bengali, but there's certainly enough ability to communicate to get to where you want to get to.
Ian, what's on the horizon for you?
Oh, that's another good question. As well as looking into creating a book from this journey, I'm also in the last throes of creating a sort of a then and now photo book from my last adventure, which was comparing images that my great uncle took in the 1940s during the Second World War in North Africa and Italy with the same scenes now when I visited. So that should be coming to an end soon. And then, well, there's always an idea for an adventure on the horizons. And I don't know, I'm quite tempted by doing a similar thing that I did in Bangladesh, but in Pakistan. So going from the northernmost to the southernmost point in Pakistan by foot. But we'll see what happens with that.
That will be interesting.
It would, and it would. It's 3 or 4 times the length of Bangladesh. So it would be a much bigger trip, but equally, if not more interesting, I think.
For that photography or that Then and Now book, were you using the same camera?
No, I wasn't. So my great uncle was using a box brownie camera, the sort of standard camera of his day, and I was using just sort of a standard digital camera. The aim really was to see how things had changed, if they had changed, and what would be recognizably the same and what wasn't.
Ian, how can people contact you if they want to learn more?
So the best place to head probably is the website, encircleafrica.org. From that, there are all my various social media accounts and email address where they can contact me.
Ian Packham, thanks for coming back on the show and sharing your story of Bangladesh. Really appreciate it. And good luck with all your future endeavors.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again for listening. And if you want to support the show, you can do so by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you listen to the podcast. You can like the show on Facebook. You can follow along on Twitter. Those handles are @ThePursuitZone. And please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or Spotify. This episode was recorded on May 3rd, 2019. And as always, for the show notes and for more great adventure travel podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.